There's a certain kind of dread that creeps up your spine when you're on a long, empty stretch of highway in the dead of night. For truckers, it's part of the job, but sometimes the dark has its own plans. This is one such story, and it's been passed around in whispers among truckers for years. It was a freezing December night when Tom started his route. He'd been hauling loads across the country for nearly 2 decades, and the road had become a second home to him. He was used to the odd silence that came with driving through the middle of nowhere, but something felt off this time. Maybe it was the thick fog that had rolled in, or the fact that his dispatcher had mentioned strange reports along this route earlier. Whatever it was, Tom brushed it off, as any seasoned trucker would. Just another night, another haul. The radio crackled, barely picking up anything but static as he turned the dial, hoping for some classic rock to cut through the monotony. Nothing. He sighed and settled into the hum of his engine, eyes scanning the barely visible road ahead. There wasn't much out here, just miles of empty fields and scattered woods, with the occasional farmhouse set back far from the road. Isolation wasn't new to him, but this felt different. About an hour into the drive, the fog seemed to thicken. His headlights struggled to cut through it, making the road ahead look like a wall of gray mist. His grip on the wheel tightened as he slowed down a bit, keeping his eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the fog, something small and flickering on the side of the road. A campfire? Maybe? As he got closer, the fire took shape. It was a figure. A person, standing by the side of the highway holding a dim lantern. No car in sight. No reason for anyone to be out there. Tom's stomach churned as he instinctively pressed the gas a little harder, wanting to get past them as quickly as possible. As his truck rumbled by, he caught a glimpse of the figure's face, illuminated in the faint glow of the lantern. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow him. Tom shivered, resisting the urge to look back. He'd heard stories of people seeing strange things on the road, but this felt like something else entirely. His heart raced as he pushed the truck forward, the figure vanishing into the fog behind him. For a few miles, Tom tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a hitchhiker or someone who'd broken down and wandered too far from their car, but something gnawed at him. He knew the look in those eyes, the emptiness. It wasn't human. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something trailing behind him, but the road was empty. He exhaled, his breath shaky. Just when he thought things couldn't get any stranger, his CB radio crackled to life. A voice, low and garbled, broke through the static. "You shouldn't have stopped." The words sent a jolt through Tom. His hand instinctively reached for the radio, but he hesitated. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't spoken to anyone. The voice continued, distorted and barely understandable, but one word was clear: lantern. Tom's skin crawled. He looked over at the radio in disbelief. The voice cut out, leaving only static behind, but the air in the cab felt heavier now. He could feel eyes on him, the kind of presence that makes your skin prickle, like you're not alone anymore. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he gripped the wheel tighter. Something wasn't right. He needed to stop and collect himself, maybe at the next rest stop, but those were few and far between out here. He decided to keep going, hoping to outrun whatever was creeping up behind him. But then the fog began to twist and swirl in front of his truck, forming shapes that seemed to move on their own. Out of the fog, something darted across the road. It was quick, too quick for Tom to get a good look. He slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. His heart raced as he stared into the swirling mist ahead, waiting for whatever had crossed his path to reappear. But there was nothing, just fog and the darkness of the highway. Tom's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to calm down. He took a moment, checking his mirrors, scanning the road behind him. Still nothing. His fingers trembled as he shifted back into gear and started moving again, but the feeling of dread hadn't left. It clung to him like the fog itself, thick and suffocating. As he continued down the highway, something began to materialize in the fog ahead. Another light, swinging slowly. The lantern. His heart dropped into his stomach. He hadn't passed anyone else. How could they be ahead of him now? Tom slowed the truck, eyes wide as the figure came into view again, standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in his path. The pale face was turned toward him, the same hollow eyes locking onto his. But there was something different. This time, there were others. More figures, standing just behind the first, all holding lanterns, all with those same lifeless eyes. Panic surged through Tom as he hit the horn, the blaring sound cutting through the fog. The figures didn't move, they just stood there, watching. He swerved the truck to the left, tires screeching on the slick road. The truck barely missed the figures, but as it passed, something slammed into the side of the cab, hard enough to rattle the whole vehicle. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He gripped the wheel, eyes darting around as he sped forward, the lanterns disappearing in the fog behind him. But the sense of dread didn't fade, it grew worse. He felt cold air creeping into the cab, though the windows were closed. His breath came out in visible puffs. Then he heard it, a scraping sound, like metal on metal, coming from the roof of his truck. His blood ran cold. It started soft, almost like something dragging across the metal. Then it grew louder, closer. He looked up at the ceiling, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The sound stopped. Silence filled the cab, but it was heavy, like something was waiting. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. A pale face, hollow eyes, grinning. Tom's scream was swallowed by the roar of the engine as his truck barreled down the highway, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching. There's a truck stop off Route 93 in the middle of the Nevada desert. Drivers say it's cursed, but it's not on any map, and you can't find it unless it finds you first. The story goes that if you pull off the highway at the wrong time, on the wrong night, you'll end up there. And once you do, getting out might be the hardest thing you've ever done. Jake was a long-haul driver, used to lonely nights on empty roads. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but that didn't matter out there in the desert. He'd heard about the truck stop from other truckers, stories that were half jokes told over too much coffee and cigarette smoke. The place had a reputation for weird things happening. Drivers going missing, strange lights in the sky, odd creatures lurking in the dark. No one took it seriously, but the kind of seriousness that hung in the air after the stories were told made you think twice. It was past midnight when Jake's GPS flickered. His rig, loaded down with steel beams, rumbled steadily through the darkness, headlights cutting a path through the barren landscape. The highway stretched endlessly before him, no other cars in sight. The GPS blinked again, and for a moment it went dark. Jake swore under his breath, giving it a thump with his hand. The screen lit back up, but the road it showed didn't match where he was headed. Instead of the straight shot through the desert, a road appeared to branch off to the right, a road that hadn't been there moments ago. Jake frowned. The last exit had been miles back. There wasn't supposed to be another one until he hit a small town way further north. But here it was, clear as day, the GPS showing a right turn. A chill ran down Jake's spine as he squinted at the screen. Maybe the GPS was glitching. He'd been driving through dead zones for hours, and technology wasn't exactly reliable out here. Still, the thought of something being off gnawed at him. But then the sign appeared. Truck stop 2 miles ahead. The letters were faded, barely legible, as if it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. Jake was tired. He hadn't seen a place to stop in hours, and his coffee thermos was running low. Against his better judgment, he slowed the truck and took the turn. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for the rig. As soon as he turned, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, like he'd crossed some invisible boundary. The darkness around him seemed thicker, pressing in on the truck from all sides. The headlights barely cut through it now, revealing only a few feet of cracked asphalt ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the truck stop appeared out of the gloom. The place was ancient, with flickering neon lights barely holding on to life. The sign read, Desert Oasis, but it was far from welcoming. The building itself looked like it had been abandoned for years, windows caked in dust, the paint peeling from the walls. There were a few other trucks parked in the lot, but something about them felt wrong. Their headlights were off, but the cabs seemed to glow faintly, like there was something inside. Watching. Jake parked his truck and sat for a moment, listening to the steady tick of the cooling engine. He felt a strange unease, a low hum in his bones that told him he shouldn't be here. But he was tired, and against his better judgment, he climbed down from the cab and headed toward the building. The door creaked open as he pushed it, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell hit him first, a thick, musty odor like something had been rotting in the walls for years. A few tables were scattered around, most of them broken or overturned. In the far corner, a figure sat hunched over a cup of coffee, though Jake couldn't make out their face in the shadows. The counter was empty. There was no one to be seen. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing through the silence. No response. He approached the counter, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. Behind the counter, an old radio sat, crackling with static. The dials were rusted, but as Jake got closer, the static shifted. Voices whispered through the crackle, words he couldn't quite make out. He leaned in, trying to listen, when suddenly the figure at the table moved. The man, or at least what looked like a man, slowly stood up. His clothes were old, worn, and covered in dust, like he hadn't left the place in years. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes didn't look human. They were too black, too hollow, as if they were voids in his face. "You should leave," the man rasped, his voice low and rough, like gravel being ground beneath a boot. "You don't belong here." Jake swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to get out, but his legs felt like lead, and the door behind him seemed a million miles away. "I just need a cup of coffee, that's all." The man didn't respond. He just stared, those hollow eyes boring into Jake's soul. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed toward the door. "They're coming." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the room grew colder. He could see his breath now, fogging in the air. The radio's static grew louder, the voices more insistent, like a chorus of whispers clawing at his mind. He turned toward the door, his legs finally moving, but when he looked outside, his blood ran cold. The other trucks, they weren't trucks anymore. They had twisted into grotesque shapes. Metal and flesh melded together in ways that defied logic. Shadows moved between them, figures crawling and writhing on the ground, dragging themselves toward the building. Their faces, they had no faces, just empty, gaping holes where their features should have been, black like the eyes of the man inside. Panic surged through Jake as he bolted for the door. His truck was his only chance. He stumbled across the parking lot, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the shadows were faster. They were closing in, the air around them rippling with unnatural heat. Their empty faces turned toward him. Jake reached the cab, yanking the door open and scrambling inside. He slammed it shut, just as one of the figures reached the truck, its hand, if you could call it that, slamming against the window. The glass cracked under the impact, but Jake didn't waste time. He jammed the keys into the ignition, praying the truck would start. The engine roared to life, and Jake floored it. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching as it barreled down the road, away from the twisted figures and the cursed truck stop. But as he sped back onto the highway, the GPS flickered again, and the road ahead had disappeared. There's a stretch of highway in the Pacific Northwest that most truckers try to avoid, especially at night. It's called Dead Man's Pass, a treacherous stretch of road that winds through steep cliffs and dense forests. The fog rolls in thick there, so thick that it feels like you're driving through a wall. But it's not the fog or the sharp turns that scare people off. It's what happens when the mist settles in and you're alone, with nothing but the distant hum of your truck and the dark trees closing in. Dale was one of those truckers who didn't believe in the stories. He'd heard them all, from old-timers in greasy diners, but to him, Dead Man's Pass was just another highway. He was on a tight deadline, and if cutting through the pass shaved an hour off his route, he wasn't about to let ghost stories slow him down. He left the last truck stop just before midnight, the sky already dark and heavy with clouds. His rig, filled with crates of canned goods, rumbled along the empty road as he merged onto the pass. The road seemed normal at first, just a winding path through the woods. Dale flicked on the radio, hoping to catch some late-night tunes, but all he got was static. He switched it off, rolling his eyes. The fog began creeping in soon after, curling around the trees and slithering across the pavement like ghostly tendrils. The temperature dropped sharply, and Dale cranked up the heat, rubbing his hands together. It was cold for a summer night, but he figured it was just the altitude. As he rounded one of the sharp turns, the fog thickened, turning the world outside his cab into a swirling, impenetrable mass. He slowed down, eyes straining to see more than a few feet ahead of him. The headlights barely cut through the mist, reflecting off the white wall like a mirror. His hands tightened on the wheel, his pulse quickening. The quiet was unnerving. No other cars, no wildlife, just the hum of his engine and the low hiss of tires on the wet road. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible through the fog. At first, Dale thought it might be a hitchhiker. He'd heard of people getting stranded out here before, but something about this person made his skin crawl. They were too still, standing in a way that didn't seem right, too stiff, like a mannequin propped up in a store window. He kept driving, not daring to slow down, but his eyes flicked back to the side mirror. The figure was gone. A chill ran down his spine. Maybe the fog had been playing tricks on him. It wouldn't be the first time the mist distorted things. But then, in the faint glow of the taillights, he saw movement. Something darting across the road behind him. He barely caught it, but whatever it was fast, too fast for a human. Dale's heart thumped against his ribcage as he pushed the accelerator. The truck picked up speed, but the fog thickened again, closing in like a living thing. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his eyes darted between the road ahead and the mirrors. He felt that unmistakable sensation of being watched, like something was out there, hiding just beyond the reach of his headlights. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life. The same static he'd heard earlier, now shifting into distorted voices. It sounded like someone whispering, low and urgent, though he couldn't make out the words. The noise sent a spike of panic through him, and he reached for the dial to turn it off, but his hand froze midway. Out of the fog, a figure appeared directly in front of the truck. Dale slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as the truck skidded to a halt, barely stopping in time. The figure was right in front of him now, standing in the center of the road, bathed in the truck's high beams. But it wasn't a person. Not anymore. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out in strange angles. Its face was the worst part, blank, featureless, with deep, hollow pits where eyes should have been. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at Dale with those empty sockets. Dale's breath hitched as pure terror flooded his veins. His instincts screamed at him to back up, to get away, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of this thing. Then, slowly, the figure tilted its head as if it were studying him, curious. A truck's engine hummed loudly in the silence, but Dale barely heard it over the pounding in his ears. And then it took a step forward. The fog swirled around it, clinging to its frame like smoke, and it began to move toward the truck, its long, spindly limbs dragging across the asphalt. Dale's paralysis broke. He threw the truck into reverse, flooring the gas pedal, but the rig lurched only a few feet before something slammed into the back of the trailer, hard enough to jolt the entire vehicle. He looked in the rearview mirror and his blood ran cold. There were more of them now, crawling out of the fog like insects, their bodies twisted and contorted. Some crawling on all fours, others limping forward, all of them heading straight for the truck. Dale panicked, slamming the truck into gear and hitting the gas again, swerving around the first figure in the road. It moved too quickly, disappearing into the fog as he sped past. But the others, they were still there, and they were getting closer. The radio crackled louder now, the whispers turning into high-pitched wails, almost like screams, filling the cab with a deafening, maddening noise. Dale tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the fog was everywhere, and the truck's headlights barely illuminated the pavement anymore. The wailing in the radio grew louder, more frantic, and his chest tightened with fear. Suddenly, the fog cleared for a split second, and up ahead, Dale saw a bridge, the exit out of Dead Man's Pass. Relief flooded him as he floored the gas, but before he could reach it, something slammed into the side of the truck. The force was so strong that the rig skidded, nearly tipping over as it swerved across the narrow road. Dale wrestled the wheel, fighting to keep the truck upright. His heart pounded as he glanced to his left, and there, running alongside the truck, was one of the creatures. It slammed into the side again, harder this time, trying to knock the truck off the road. Its eyeless face pressed up against the driver's window, skin stretched tight over a grinning skull. With a surge of adrenaline, Dale yanked the wheel, swerving away from the creature, and the truck roared toward the bridge. The fog closed in again, but he could see the lights just ahead, the way out. But just as he reached the bridge, the truck jolted violently. He looked in the side mirror and saw the rear trailer, mangled and torn, its cargo spilling across the road as the creatures tore into it, their pale hands clawing at the steel, pulling themselves up onto the rig. Dale screamed, slamming the gas pedal down harder. The truck groaned under the strain, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. As the rig crossed the bridge, the fog lifted, and the creatures were gone. Just like that, the night was still, the road behind him empty. But Dale didn't slow down. He drove through the night, not stopping until he was miles away, until the sun began to rise and the fog was a distant memory. He never drove Dead Man's Pass again. Some roads, he learned, were never meant to be traveled at night. There's a remote highway in the deep south, a stretch of forgotten road between small towns that seem to have faded from maps. The locals call it the Devil's Mile. It's a narrow, winding path lined with thick woods that block out most of the moonlight, even on clear nights. Truckers who drive through it speak in hushed tones about the things they've seen, things that have no place in the waking world. But most of those stories get lost in the static of CB radios, never making it past the next rest stop. Gary had been driving for nearly 15 years, never paying much attention to the trucker legends. He'd heard about the Devil's Mile, but like most stories that float around, he dismissed it as the kind of nonsense drivers use to spook rookies. His route that night had taken him across back roads, his rig carrying a full load of construction materials to a site out in the boonies. The GPS showed a shortcut through some old, forgotten roads, and though it meant cutting across the Devil's Mile, Gary wasn't one to waste time or gas. It was just after midnight when Gary found himself on that narrow road. The trees on both sides seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The headlights barely pierced through the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows that twisted and moved as the truck rolled forward. The road was uneven, cracked in places, but Gary kept his foot steady on the gas. He had a deadline to meet, and nothing was going to slow him down. The first hour passed in silence, just the hum of the engine and the occasional thud of the tires over a pothole. The air felt heavy, damp, and cold, despite it being a warm summer night. The further he drove, the more Gary noticed a strange static creeping into his radio, even though it was turned off. At first, it was faint, just a low hum, but soon it grew louder, buzzing in his ears like a swarm of insects. Then the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, thick and sudden, blanketing the road in a ghostly white sheet. Gary slowed the truck, squinting into the mist, but visibility dropped to near nothing. His hands tightened on the wheel as he inched forward, the engine's rumble sounding hollow in the thick fog. He could barely see the road, let alone any turns or hazards. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft hiss of the tires on the damp pavement. And then came the knock. A single, soft tap on the passenger side window. Gary's heart skipped a beat. He glanced over, his blood running cold. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. No other vehicles, no houses, nothing but trees for miles. The knock came again, louder this time. It was deliberate, too purposeful to be the wind or some animal. Against every instinct screaming at him to keep driving, Gary looked out the window. At first, he saw nothing, just the swirling fog and the dim outline of trees beyond. But then, slowly, a shape materialized out of the mist. A figure standing impossibly close to the truck, too close for him to have missed it just moments before. It was a woman, or at least the shape of one, with long, tangled hair and pale skin that looked almost translucent in the fog. She was staring directly at him, her eyes black and hollow, her mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide. Gary's breath caught in his throat, his mind raced. How had she gotten there? Where had she come from? But there was no time to think. He slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as the engine roared to life. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the fog, watching as the truck sped away. The knock came again, this time from the back of the cab. Gary's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The fog had thickened, but he could make out shapes moving behind the truck, shadows darting in and out of the mist. Panic gripped him as the knocking continued, louder and more insistent. It sounded like hands, dozens of them, slapping against the sides of the trailer, trying to get in. He pushed the truck faster, ignoring the cracks in the road and the sharp turns. The radio, which had been dead for hours, suddenly crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, broke through the static. "You can't run," it whispered, the words stretching out, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking was right inside the cab. "You're already here." Gary swore under his breath, fumbling for the radio dial. He twisted it frantically, but the voice wouldn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, until it was deafening, filling the cab with an unnatural grating sound. "You can't leave." The truck jolted violently as something heavy slammed into the back of the trailer. Gary's grip tightened on the wheel as he tried to keep control. The fog was so thick now, it felt like driving through a sea of clouds. The road ahead was barely visible, but in the rearview mirror, Gary could see them. The shadows. They were running, keeping pace with the truck. Their forms barely human, twisted and wrong. Limbs too long, faces blurred, mouths gaping open in silent screams. He floored the gas, desperate to outrun whatever was chasing him, but the truck struggled under the strain. The engine whined, gears grinding as the speed climbed, but the figures only grew closer. The knocking turned into pounding, fists slamming into the sides of the cab, the roof, the doors. Gary's pulse raced as the windshield began to crack, small spiderwebs of glass spreading across the surface with each hit. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a figure appeared in the road ahead. It was the woman again, her eyes glowing now, her body floating just above the ground. Gary's hands shook as he swerved to avoid her, the truck veering off the road. The tires skidded, the weight of the trailer pulling the rig to the side as it crashed through the trees. Branches snapped and shattered against the windshield, but some trucks stayed upright. Gary didn't stop. He couldn't. He kept driving, the trees thinning out as he barreled through the underbrush. The fog started to lift, just enough for him to see the outline of the road ahead. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. But as the truck rumbled back onto the asphalt, the fog cleared entirely and the pounding stopped. Silence fell over the road, the night still and cold. Gary glanced in the mirrors, expecting to see the shadows, the figures still following him, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of highway behind him. Relief flooded through him, though his hands still shook on the wheel. He kept driving, not daring to stop until he was well beyond the boundaries of the Devil's Mile. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his heart still hammering in his chest. It wasn't until he reached the next town hours later that he pulled over to check the truck. He climbed out, legs shaky, and walked around to the back. The trailer was covered in deep scratches, long gouges that ran the length of the metal. The glass on the passenger side was cracked, and the roof, there were dents, small ones, as if someone or something had been crawling on top. Gary never drove the Devil's Mile again. Some roads are best left forgotten, buried in the mist where they belong. There's a road that cuts through the Appalachian Mountains, known among truckers as the Shadow Stretch. It's a winding, isolated road that twists through deep valleys and dense forests, barely wide enough for a single rig to pass without scraping the guardrails. The stories surrounding the place are as old as the mountains themselves, passed down from one generation to the next. Some say that things lurk in the trees, while others talk about shadows that move when they shouldn't. But whatever the case, most truckers only take the shadow stretch when they absolutely have no other option. Charlie didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or whatever else people claim to see out there. He'd been driving trucks for over 20 years, through rainstorms, blizzards, and even a tornado once. A little mountain road wasn't going to scare him. His load was a rush job, hauling equipment to a mining site deep in the Appalachians. The dispatcher warned him about the route, suggesting he wait until morning, but Charlie didn't want to waste time. He figured he'd get through it in a few hours. No problem. The road started out normal enough, just a quiet, moonless night. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The trees were so thick, they felt like walls, closing in on both sides. It was one of those roads where your GPS stops working and radio stations vanish into static. Charlie didn't mind. He liked the solitude. About an hour in, though, something felt off. The truck started to make this strange humming sound, low and constant, like a vibration that wasn't quite normal. He pulled over at a small clearing to check it out, stepping down into the chilly night air. The hum was gone as soon as he left the cab. He walked around the truck, inspecting the tires, the engine, the trailer. Everything seemed fine. As he climbed back into the driver's seat, that hum returned, but this time it was more than just a sound. He felt it in his bones, deep and unsettling. The air seemed heavier somehow, like the atmosphere was pressing down on him, but he shook it off, assuming it was just fatigue from the long day. Back on the road, the hum persisted, a constant companion in the otherwise silent night. But then, about 20 minutes later, something darted across the road just beyond the reach of his headlights. It was fast, too fast for him to get a good look, but it was big, much bigger than a deer or any animal that should have been out there. It was just a dark blur, a shadow against the night. Charlie slowed down, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the road remained empty. He kept driving, telling himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks. But the further he went, the more his instincts screamed that something was wrong. The trees on both sides seemed to close in even tighter, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, like claws reaching out to grab at the truck. And then he saw them. Figures, barely visible in the shadows along the side of the road. At first, he thought they were animals, maybe coyotes or wolves, but as he got closer, he realized they were human-shaped. But they weren't moving. They just stood there, motionless, watching the truck as it passed. Charlie's grip tightened on the wheel as he kept his eyes straight ahead, refusing to look directly at them. His heart pounded in his chest, and the temperature inside the cab seemed to drop. The radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly crackled with static. The hum, that low vibration, grew louder, almost like it was coming from the truck itself. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the figures kept appearing, more of them now, standing in the trees and the ditches on the side of the road. All just watching. The fog rolled in next, thick and suffocating, swallowing the truck in its cold embrace. Visibility dropped to nothing, and Charlie had to slow down even more, his eyes straining to see the road ahead. The figures were still there, barely visible through the mist, but now they were closer, lining the road on both sides. And then, without warning, the truck's headlights flickered, just for a second, but long enough to make his stomach drop. When they came back on, something was standing in the middle of the road. Charlie slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching as it skidded to a halt, stopping just inches from the figure. His heart raced as he stared out the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, unnaturally tall, with a thin, gaunt frame. His clothes were tattered, hanging off him like rags, and his skin was pale, almost gray. But it was his face that sent a chill down Charlie's spine. It was blank. No eyes, no nose, just smooth, featureless skin stretched tight over bone. Charlie's breath hitched in his throat as the figure slowly tilted its head as if it were studying him. The truck idled in the silence, the only sound the low hum that had been following him all night. And then, in a motion too quick to be human, the figure lunged at the truck. Charlie floored the gas, the tires spinning on the slick road before catching traction. The truck roared forward, and for a moment he thought he was going to hit the thing. But when he looked back, it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the fog. His hands trembled on the wheel as he sped down the road, heart hammering in his chest. But the figures, they were still there. Only now, they were moving. Out of the trees, onto the road, dozens of them walking toward the truck. He swerved to avoid them, barely keeping control of the rig as the road twisted and turned. But no matter how fast he drove, the figures kept coming, appearing in front of him, behind him, beside him. They moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching, their faces all blank and featureless. The hum grew louder, deafening now, rattling the cab as the truck sped faster and faster. Charlie's mind raced, panic gripping him as he tried to outrun whatever was happening. The fog pressed in on all sides, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending nightmare. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the fog began to lift and the road straightened out. The figures disappeared, fading back into the trees, and the hum stopped. Charlie didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, hours later, pulling into the parking lot of an old diner. His hands still shook as he stepped out of the truck, legs weak beneath him. He walked into the diner, barely able to speak as he ordered a coffee. The waitress gave him a knowing look as she set the mug down in front of him. "The shadow stretch get to you?" she asked, her voice low. Charlie just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Yeah, she said, her eyes distant, like she'd heard it all before. You're lucky. Most don't make it out. Charlie never drove that road again. Some places aren't meant to be understood, only survived. There's a desolate truck stop off Highway 93, nestled in the heart of the Nevada desert. It's not on any maps, and it's the kind of place that only veteran truckers know about. The legend goes that it only shows up when you're truly lost or running on fumes, and if you find it, you might wish you hadn't. Drivers call it the last stop, and the stories that come out of there are the kind that make you question reality. Sam had been on the road for nearly 14 hours straight. His delivery was behind schedule, and he had pushed through the exhaustion hoping to make up time. The sun had long since set, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the empty desert stretching out in all directions. He hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and the gas gauge was dropping fast. The GPS had given up hours ago, showing him in the middle of nowhere with no towns or rest stops in sight. Just when he was about to give up and pull over for the night, he saw it. A flicker of neon light on the horizon. A gas station, maybe a diner, glowing faintly in the distance. Relief washed over him as he headed toward the lights, the truck rumbling down the lonely highway. As he got closer, Sam saw the outline of an old truck stop, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The neon sign buzzed above the gas pumps, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked pavement. The words "last stop" flickered on and off in a stuttering rhythm. A small diner sat next to the pumps, its windows fogged up, but inside he could see shadows moving like someone was still working the night shift. Sam pulled the rig into the lot, his tires crunching over the gravel. The place felt abandoned, but there were old cars parked around the back, ancient, rusted things that looked like they hadn't moved in decades. He didn't care. He needed gas and maybe a cup of coffee to keep himself going for the last leg of the trip. Stepping out of the truck, he immediately noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. The desert was supposed to be silent, but this was different. There was no wind, no sounds of night creatures, nothing. Just the buzz of the neon sign and the low hum of the gas pumps. Sam made his way inside the diner. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the smell of old grease and stale coffee hit him immediately. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to him, wiping down a glass with slow, deliberate movements. There were a few people seated in the booths, but they were oddly still, their heads down like they were deep in thought or asleep. "Coffee, please," Sam said, his voice sounding louder than it should in the quiet space. The waitress didn't respond, just kept wiping the same glass over and over. Sam cleared his throat and glanced around. The people in the booth still hadn't moved. One man was hunched over his food, a fork poised in the air, but frozen in place like a statue. "Hey, you all right?" Sam asked, stepping closer. As he reached out to tap the man's shoulder, his hand recoiled. The man's skin was ice cold, and his eyes were open, but they were glassy, lifeless. His lips were parted slightly, as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Sam backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong here, very wrong. The air in the diner felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. The other patrons in the booths began to stir, but not like normal people. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. One by one, they turned their heads toward Sam, their eyes empty and black. Sam stumbled backward, his pulse racing as a cold sweat broke out across his skin. He bolted for the door, the bell jingling again as he shoved it open and ran out into the night. The gas station was bathed in that same eerie red glow, the neon sign still buzzing like an angry insect. His truck sat where he'd left it, but something was off. The hood was open, though he hadn't touched it, and as he approached, he saw that the engine was in pieces. The wires were ripped out, metal parts scattered across the ground, as if something or someone had torn it apart while he was inside. Sam's breath hitched in his throat as he turned back toward the diner. The lights inside flickered wildly now, and the figures were standing at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, watching him. The waitress stood in the doorway, her head cocked to the side, a slow, twisted smile spreading across her face. Desperate, Sam ran to the pumps. His hands shook as he fumbled for his wallet, trying to force the nozzle into the tank. The pump groaned as if it hadn't been used in years, but no gas came out. The neon sign flickered again, and out of the corner of his eye, Sam saw movement near the back of the station. There was something there, something tall and thin, barely visible in the shadows. It moved unnaturally, its limbs long and spindly, too many joints bending the wrong way. It crept closer, crawling along the ground like some twisted insect, its body making a sickening crunch with every movement. Sam's heart pounded in his ears as he dropped the nozzle and ran back toward his truck, but there was no escape. The creature was faster, its elongated arms reaching out, fingers like claws digging into the pavement as it pulled itself forward. It didn't make a sound, but Sam could feel its presence bearing down on him, oppressive and terrifying. He scrambled into the cab, slamming the door shut just as the thing reached the side of the truck. It pressed its face against the window, a face that wasn't human. No eyes, no nose, just a gaping mouth full of needle-like teeth. It scratched at the glass, the sound sending chills down Sam's spine. The truck wouldn't start. He turned the key over and over, but the engine just sputtered, lifeless. The lights inside the cab flickered, and in the mirror, Sam saw them. The figures from the diner, walking toward the truck in slow, deliberate steps. Their faces were blank, eyes black and hollow, their mouths twisted into those same unnatural smiles. The neon sign buzzed louder, the red light bathing the entire scene in a hellish glow. Sam pounded on the steering wheel, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, but it was no use. The figures closed in, surrounding the truck, their cold hands pressing against the windows. And then, everything went silent. The buzzing stopped, the figures froze, and for a brief moment there was nothing but the quiet hum of the desert. Sam's heart slowed, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. He reached for the door handle, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could make a run for it. But before he could move, the creature at the window grinned, its mouth opening impossibly wide. The last thing Sam saw was darkness. The truck was found 2 days later, abandoned at a rest stop hundreds of miles away. No one knows how it got there, and Sam was never seen again. Some say he's still out there, driving through the desert, lost on roads that don't exist, forever searching for a way out of the last stop.